as Dana and Kristen mentioned, for many years I worked in film marketing and advertising, which means I have seen thousands of trailers for horror movies. And in many of these films, one of the most common tropes, and you're all familiar with it, it's a group of young kids, usually high school students or college kids. They find themselves in the woods, and there they manage to discover a rickety old cabin. And despite their better judgment, they decide to spend the night there. And at first they're having the best time, they're joking around, they're laughing, they're drinking, and then nightfall comes, and everything is still and silent and dark. And we as viewers just know that something really, really bad is about to go down. But the thing is, it's not the dark in and of itself that terrifies us. It's what the dark represents, and that's the unknown. We have no idea what form of the unknown we're going to encounter here. Do ghosts haunt the house? Will there be creepy child twins in the hallway? Do ghouls reach their arms out from the walls? Could one of the main characters who we've been acquainted with end up being like an axe murderer? The point is, we don't know. All we know is that the dark is ambiguous, formless, disorienting, and at worst, dangerous. But any story that becomes a common trope or archetype represents and says something about the society and the time that we live in. And this idea of the unknown being a dangerous space is an idea that we've abided by for thousands of years now. Think about Grimm's fairy tales, or any of the fairy tales you grew up listening to. Children are told from the get-go to avoid the unknown, to be afraid of the dark. And this is so wired into our systems that we pretty much structure our lives in order to outsmart the unknown and gird ourselves against it because it's so intolerable and repugnant to us. And we do this in hundreds of different ways, many of which you're familiar with. We map where we're going so we don't get lost. We log meetings and events into our phones. We document the past. We plan the future. We speak to experts about our investments. We invest an enormous amount of our energy and resources towards minimizing the anxiety that the unknown causes us, by either quantifying or narrativizing it. In fact, for every inspirational quote that I could give you about the path less taken, and I'm sure you've heard many of them, probably something like 20 people in your life, and this is 20 people who are close to you and love you, they will tell you not to take that path. They will say, whatever you do, do not take the unknown path. Take the well-lit one. Take the one with lots of foot traffic, the one that's kind of like a boardwalk with scenic views. But there's one problem with this, and that's the fact that everything that has ever been created has come out of the void of the unknown. So all the great art that we've ever seen or heard or read, all of the inventions that we benefit from every day exist because someone ventured into the unknown on our behalf, which means that they sat with uncertainty, ambiguity, a total lack of guarantees that their efforts would pay off, and in many cases, an immense fear of failure. In this talk, I'm not going to tell you how to outsmart the unknown or minimize uncertainty and ambiguity in your life, because frankly, that's what the entire structure of our society is there for. What I am going to talk about is my own experience harnessing and getting acquainted with the unknown, as well as how ancient cultures and creatives and artists have addressed this phenomenon over time and used it to their benefit as well as the benefit of others. Let's start with this. What exactly is the unknown? The Rig Veda, the ancient Indian text, describes it in a creation hymn somewhat paradoxically by invoking what it is not. It is not the non-existent. And that definition has a lot of double negatives, and it's very hard to understand. So I will give you another definition. Artists call the unknown negative space. It's the shadows in a painting, the dark that informs the light. Without it, there's no form, but by itself, it has no form either. Carl Jung was another person who was fascinated with the unknown. In Western psychology, this dark matter became known as the unconscious, and Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. So all of these definitions point to a few central truths about the unknown, that it is immensely powerful, that it is astoundingly mysterious, and it is ultimately a paradox, right? I mean, you can't venture into the space with an agenda, and yet it holds clues to some of the greatest questions of our time. Scientists at CERN who are working on the Hadron Collider are not entirely sure what they could discover if their experiment is successful, but they believe that it could be the answer to everything. There's no map to the unknown. In fact, the rules that seem to govern the physical world in which we live don't appear to apply there, and you can enter it at any time from any place. It is one of the most mysterious, fertile, and powerful spaces. So my own journey into the unknown begins in 2012, as I mentioned before, and I worked in entertainment marketing for many years, and after years of planning and socking away my savings and organizing and structuring my days, something I was very, very good at, I decided to do the thing I always wanted to but never had the courage to. I quit my job and decided to write a novel. And this was a risk, but a very conservative one that had taken me 30-something years to take. And at the time, my life was very structured and settled. I had worked in the same office for about 7 years. I had lived in the same home for about that long. I had been in a near decade-long relationship, and most of my days were tightly scheduled, and all my energy and resources went into preserving everything that was a part of that schedule: my work, my time, my relationships, my possessions, because I did not like the unknown. I avoided it at all costs, and for the most part pretended it didn't exist, because even thinking about the things that I did not know made me feel kind of like I was going to die a little bit. And you might sort of relate to this, some of you. But a couple of months after I left my job, forfeiting the security of the workplace, my relationship of nearly a decade ended, and soon after that, I had to move out of the home that I had lived in, putting all my possessions and belongings in storage. So I packed whatever I could fit into a large suitcase and a carry-on, which wasn't very much, like clothes, books, a few personal keepsakes, my laptop, toothbrush. And I told myself that now was not the best time for a breakdown, because breakdowns are very inconvenient. They're very time-consuming. And I basically hinged all my hopes on this manuscript I was working on, because it had swiftly become the only tangible certainty in my life. And I told myself, but at least I have that. So at this point in the story, you already know this is not going to end well. And I spent the next year and a half working on this manuscript, and at the end of that period, started sending out queries to agents. At first, many were enthusiastic about reading it, a very good sign. But one by one, the rejections began to come in, and each one felt like a visceral blow to my psyche and this fragile sense of hope I had that all of this would eventually work out. When the last rejection came in, I had to actually face what my life had become. I had no job, no relationship, no home, and I had failed at what I had sought out to do. For the first time in my life, I was floating without a safety net of any sort, no certainty, no plans, and this for a person who basically, laid out her clothes every evening before work and planned her days months in advance was beyond terrifying and humiliating. I had basically risked everything and failed. So when I received a very lucrative job offer from a Hollywood studio, close friends and family urged me to take it. They were like, this journey into the unknown, great learning experience, which is what people will always tell you, but now it's time to return to normal life. And yet I found that despite myself, I couldn't accept this job. And some of you will be able to relate to this, because every time I picked up the phone in order to call HR to accept this position, I just would burst out crying, and something deep within me screamed, whatever you do, don't go back now. Which was beyond ridiculous, because it's not like I had any other viable plan in front of me. So now I was in the midst of this crisis. That word actually derives from the Greek word krisis, which means decision. But a crisis isn't just any decision one makes on a day-to-day basis, like what to have for lunch or what to wear for a business meeting. A crisis makes us question the very narrative that's familiar, the story that you've been told millions of times, the story that you've grown up with, kind of like the haunted house story that I showed you earlier. And it makes you ask yourself whether it's your story, your truth. In my case, as a child growing up, I moved from place to place. Some as a result of my parents' work. Some of the communities that I entered were welcoming, and others were downright hostile. And my only way of surviving a hostile or exclusive environment was to conform. And I learned to do this really, really well, and I truly believed that if I just conformed, if I took the well-lit path instead of the dark and shadowy one, if I just did as I was told and didn't question things too much and didn't make others around me uncomfortable, that I would be okay, that I would feel safe, and those around me would feel safe and not threatened by me too. But there's one problem with this, and the writer Rita Mae Brown articulates it far better than I ever could. She says that the reward for conformity is that everybody likes you, except for yourself. And the only thing I knew for certain in that moment is, if I stay on the known path, I'll never find out who I am or what this thing is that's calling out to me. So I turned down the job, And I did the most terrifying and freeing thing I have ever done in my life. I gave myself permission to not have a plan because, you see, something had happened to prepare me for this crisis. My old life was gone, having experienced failure and humiliation, and without having things to think about or take care of. I initially felt as though a part of me had died, and perhaps it had. But I also felt oddly free of expectations, free of stuff, free even of the identity that I had carried with me for so long, and I slowly came around to not seeing that as a bad thing. Doris Lessing, in her collection of essays, The Prisons We Choose to Live Inside, says that it's only when we leave our own country and travel to another foreign land that we're able to catch a glimpse of ourselves with foreign eyes and to see the great, comforting illusions that may have had us in their tight grasp. For me, the unknown was like that foreign country. I was able to see something within myself that I couldn't have seen with my old eyes. So in case you're also wondering where I was at this point in the story, I was still really miserable and alone and lost, and I still spent many of my evenings inhabiting this like formless space of no plans and no possessions and no rituals, except for one ritual. In the evenings, I would sit on my couch wrapped in a blanket, and I would watch Cosmos, narrated by Neil deGrasse Tyson, who has a very soothing voice, and I would cry. There was so much about the world that I didn't understand, and so many things that would always remain mysterious to me. And as I slowly came to accept this, I found myself spending more and more time in front of my laptop again, writing a book about the unknown. That book about the discovery of an alternate Earth light years away is called Mirror in the Sky. So people sometimes ask me, and this is kind of like a spoiler, why don't the characters in your novel get to actually travel to Terra Nova, the mirror planet? And I tell them that's actually the entire point of the story. It's about how our imaginings of a thing are often more powerful than the reality of it, and how those imaginings come from our need to put form or a narrative around an unknown instead of allowing it to just be and seeing what it has to teach us. In Mirror in the Sky, this becomes a global pathology. Everybody on this planet begins to believe that there's a version of themselves light years away, having way more fun than they are, living a way better life than the one that they chose. It's like global FOMO. And this might actually sound familiar, because it's actually a metaphor for how we objectify ourselves in the race to live a life that looks slightly more fun, slightly more fulfilling, and slightly more beautiful than the lives of our peers. Forget how it actually feels. It is alarming how much time we spend measuring and documenting such externals, largely on social media. Rebecca Solnit, who wrote the book Men Explain Things to Me, calls this phenomenon the tyranny of the quantifiable, and it's tyrannical because we're slaves to it. In writing this book, I had to confront for the first time the conflicting messages and expectations about who we, and by we I'm speaking largely of women, but also of some men, who we're expected to be in this world, because it sometimes feels like there's no acceptable way to be a woman, or maybe even human. Just look at this election. And I also had to consider what it means to live and create in a world where the default is fear and conformity. One of my favorite writers, Virginia Woolf, who, among her other accomplishments, has a cameo in my book, she often speaks of the dark and the unknown as a liberating space, rather than the terror and angst-ridden one that we make it out to be. For her, the darkness exists outside the realm of expectations and institutions. She celebrates going beyond the safe and the familiar, and she also speaks of killing the angel in the house, the ideal woman who meets others' expectations and not her own. In Mirror in the Sky, a group of teenagers whose lives look beautiful to anyone on the outside looking in are all struggling with their deepest flaws, their humiliations, their shame, their failure, their suffering. But their lives look perfect from a distance, just as many of yours must, just as mine once did. But when we choose the unknown, we choose to see what can't be seen with the eyes. We realize that we all suffer and hurt and fail and stumble. We know in our bones what Jack Kerouac once said, that we are all the same that far down in our subconscious. We share this one thing known as the human experience, and we live it out on this tiny sphere of the cosmos. Our time here is short and beautiful and unique and universal, but it will one day end. Our lives will end, and this mesmerizing and fascinating place called Earth will not exist anymore. This is the only time we're ever going to get to delve into that unknown and find out who we really are and what we're really capable of. these walls and divisions that we create through our perceptions, what we call the world of the known, it is simply an illusion, and that illusion will not keep us safe. It will leave us blind to who we are and what this experience on this planet is about. I'm going to leave you with a story that my grandmother used to tell me. In ancient Indian mythology, the Mahabharata was the largest war ever fought. And one of the battle formations was the Chakravyuha, which was kind of like a wheel spinning round and round, filled with warriors swinging their swords at every turn. And entering this wheel was virtually impossible, and very few people knew how to do it. But Arjun, who was one of the key characters in the Mahabharata, he knew how to get in. And so he often relayed the strategy to his wife, Subhadra, who was pregnant at the time. Now, Subhadra found this talk of battle formations incessantly boring and often tuned out and fell asleep. But Abhimanyu, Arjun and Subhadra's son in utero, was quietly listening all along. Fast forward to 16 years later, when it was Abhimanyu's turn to venture into battle. Though he had never seen it, never even heard of it outside of his time in the womb, he recognized the Chakravyuha and he knew how to enter. Though he may have had no recollection of his father narrating the design to his mother, some deeper part of him understood and recognized his own destiny. I truly believe that if you can find the courage to break away from the familiar and from the expectations that others have of you, you are following in a radical tradition of transforming yourself as you transform the world. Perhaps no one told us when we were growing up about our own extraordinary powers to reshape the world and ourselves, but that doesn't mean that we can't discover it on our own. People have been doing this through the ages, questioning this world and changing it, rather than believing that life is simply here to be lived. And these people were just as uncertain and scared and lost as you are and as I am, but still they did it. They believed that this entire sphere that we inhabit could be created anew, that they themselves could be created anew, and they followed nothing but a hunch into that great void, often leaving everything else behind, borders and boundaries, identities and possessions. All that was left was the great darkness from which everything comes. And in that darkness, they found what the great poet Hafiz has referred to as the astonishing light of one's own being. And so I urge you to become acquainted with the unknown, to make it your friend, to venture there with humility and a spirit of curiosity. And perhaps this is really the key, to trust it and trust yourself. And I think you'll find, just as I did, just as Abhimanyu did, just as any artist or entrepreneur has, that you carried a reflection of that truth within you all along. Thank you.